Okay. Yep, go ahead. Hello, I'm Carol Hunter, Executive Editor of the Des Moines Register, and we're here with Joe Sestak.
Thanks.
He was a 3-star admiral in the U.S. Navy, so thank you for your service.
Thank you very much.
Also a 2-term representative from Pennsylvania, serving the 7th District there. And now he's running for the Democratic nomination for the presidency. So welcome, Joe.
Thanks, Carol. Glad to be here.
Let's go around and introduce the Register's editorial board and also other staffers here.
I'm Katie Aiken. I'm a politics reporter.
I'm Claire Ulmer. I'm also a politics reporter.
Rachel Stassenberger. I'm the politics editor.
Andy Dominic, editorial writer.
So we'll start with the easy one. Give us your elevator pitch on why you should be president and why you're the best choice for voters.
First, I think just to clarify that the reason I'm late into the race was my daughter's brain cancer, which she'd had at 4 years old, came back. And so she's now in a safe harbor. That said, I am running because I believe that this nation most yearns, more than anything else, for someone who has actually demonstrated accountability to people above party, above any special interest, and certainly above oneself, such as when I ran against Senator Arlen Specter when he switched parties. Against my party's desires, I ran against him, but he was the man that tried to humiliate Anita Hill, if you remember, when he had brought, she had brought sexual harassment charges against now Supreme Court Clarence Thomas. I think that accountability for people is what this country most needs to heal itself. Second, I think it needs a leader who actually has a breadth and depth of global experience, that understands the world, has worked in the White House to coordinate the administrations during the Clinton administration's national security strategy, not just the power of our military, but the power of diplomacy's ideals, the power of our economy, because there are dangers abroad from climate change, where 85% of the damage is from overseas, not just here. And how do you compel nations to confront those challenges? And third, finally, if we have a leader who is actually trusted, like I was in my nearly 2-to-1 Republican district, and reelected as the second Democrat since the Civil War, but reelected without spending a dime on a campaign ad, maybe we can then, if you're trusted, begin to move policies here at home forward, from immigration reform to infrastructure investment to small business growth. Because otherwise we'll just have a president who can institute executive orders and the next one rips them out. Accountability for people, a breadth and depth of global experience to protect our American dream of home, as presidents from John F. Kennedy to Ronald Reagan understood it was the global concord we led that protected us, and then the trust of all Americans, united with a leader who's accountable to them, that can move our domestic needs here at home and policies, and finally get the Congress moving forward with the White House.
As a 3-star admiral, you were the highest-ranking military member ever elected to Congress. You also commanded sailors in operations for the Afghanistan and Iraqi wars. Given what you saw there, what America did right and wrong in prosecuting those wars, how would that affect you as Commander-in-Chief?
The principle that people have to understand, and those Democrats and Republicans alike who voted for that tragic misadventure in Iraq, had a little understanding first of the world. What is a Sunni, what is a Shia? But they had less of an understanding that militaries never fix a problem. They can stop them, but they never fix them. I don't think anybody sitting here or listening thinks we fixed Iraq. As we unleashed with our invasion, Shia against Sunni, Sunni against Shia, and former generals of Saddam Hussein then formed ISIS. And then as it metastasized, it took us into Syria and beyond, even copycat killings of ISIS in Los Angeles. And 2 decades of unaccountable consequences in the Middle East were left behind, with loss of faith from our Americans in our engagement in the world, as well as our U.S. leadership. People need to understand, like as we approaching Iran today, that we had fixed Iran with our diplomacy by bringing nations of the world we convened together, including Russia and China, and removed the nuclear warfare capability, weapon-making capability from Iran for a minimum of a year and probably for decades. We did it, we disarmed them without a shot. because we used America's greatest power, its power to convene, to do that. And now we think we're going to use our military after we had already fixed it? If we were to strike Iran, if nuclear making weapons capability, truly try to destroy it, we'd have to come out of the Persian Gulf because we can't survive there with the carrier battle groups I've operated there. We can't find their 19 mini submarines. Our sonar doesn't work there. They'll close the Straits of Hormuz, closing down 20% of all oil coming to the world. And then we'll take weeks to months as hundreds of missiles rain down on Israel and others. And finally, we'll get through maybe those 300 feet of rockets underneath its infrastructure. But 4 years later, they can rebuild.
You called it
My
a
lessons were-
tragic misadventure. Did
Yes.
you express those concerns when you were serving?
Yes, I was asked by a
About that.
three-star admiral as the commander of my carrier battle group, so what do you think we're doing? I said, we're ready to go, because I had to do the precursor combat ops. In fact, I wrote about this in an op-ed years ago in the Philadelphia Inquirer. And he said, no, what do you think personally? I said, what are we doing? There's no clear and present danger to us. Not only that, we're splitting our forces. Why don't we finish Iraq? Because remember, about a few years later, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said in testimony, after we went into that tragic misadventure, he said, in Iraq, we do what we must. In Afghanistan, we do what we can. When you're in conflict, you don't do just what you can. But that's what happened because we split our forces. Number two, as I said many times, including the book I mentioned, if we had fixed the illiteracy rate of women in Afghanistan, when I was on the ground there at the very beginning of the war, for a very brief period, gathering with SEALs in broken down farmhouses, trying to assess new rules of engagement with high-tech air power of the ground, I came back and I said, you know, as this continues, if we fix this illiteracy rate of women, we'll do more to fix the global war of terror. Then our military today, after 19 years of war, 18 years of war, is courageous still trying to stop it. No, those lessons were also learned from me, to your beginning questions, from the breadth of 31 years, but also because the Navy invested in me. This nation did. For example, sent me to Harvard University for a doctorate, both in economics and national security, so that in the White House I got to see how all the elements work and how America convened the world. That's why I was able to draw those principles out of saying, this is a tragic misadventure. And what brought it home also was this, if I might. When I arrived in the aircraft after coming out of Afghanistan, I was given the highest honor our nation can bestow upon anyone, to lead our sons and daughters in harm's way, 10,000 sailors, Marines, and SEALs. And so when my aircraft carrier battle group arrived in the Arabian Sea, what was waiting for us was an international armada. Japan was there, has not been outside the sea of Japan since the end of the Second World War. Germany was there, Italy. But Italy said why they all came. In a message, he said, some may think we Italians are better lovers than warriors. But America has been attacked, and we will be there for them. We had convened the world. Then I was sent, after having those ships come within our command, into the Persian Gulf some months later. And only the Australians and the British came with us. It was very obvious, as I've written, that our leadership did not know the third principle I've talked about here. Militaries can stop a problem, not fix them. America's greatest power is to convene the world, as we did after the Second World War, for a collective good to win the Third World War without a shot, the Cold War. But third, leaders better know how it will end when faced with a decision to use our military before deciding to begin. And the rest of those countries, as I've written, knew that our leadership could not tell them how Iraq would end before it began. But it was obvious to me.
Anyone ever knows how a war is going to end.
Oh,
when it
I think
begins.
they did in
But do
World
you
War
think-
II.
So do you think it was a mistake for us to go on the ground in Iraq? I mean, what should Bush have done?
We should not have even intervened at all. Why? Iran, and what was the danger? Chemical shells that went 12 miles. That was the danger of of weapons of mass destruction. And then they never found them. Number two, people went in and didn't have this understanding of the world. And I would begin, a lot of the problems even till today began with that tragic misadventure. And third, Iraq, Saddam Hussein and Iran were kind of keeping each other at bay. once we removed Iraq, who had fought, as you well know, obviously, this decades of plus war of their own, and were kind of just sitting there deterring, we also unleashed a bit of freedom for Iran to do mischief elsewhere in the world.
Do you think the military is the right size now?
No.
One of the things in your past is that you had developed a program to actually reduce number of ships, which was controversial at the time.
It's extraordinarily controversial. Again, as I told you, I believe in analysis, and that's, you know, as Napoleon said, if I could repeat it here, is if I were to be in love, I would analyze it bit by bit, because you can't ask how or why enough. So the analysis, as I had come back from the war, I was placed in charge of what was called a black hat analytical group to work directly for the Chief of Naval Operations. Anything that went to him on personnel, budget, Congress, anything from 3 or 4 stars, and I was only a 2, was given to me to give an alternative black hat analysis. Out of that, I was given about 100 people and about $14 million, which is kind of decimal dust in the military, but it's enough to analyze with computers and others, and to work with NRO. And then he, after I came up with what you mentioned, he said, I'm making you a 3-star and I want you to implement it. And the idea, and what we came up with, which was briefed to Congress, instead of aiming for that 375 ship level, we needed about 260. We did not need 54 submarines, we needed about 34, 35, because it was obvious that water was going to become translucent, if not transparent. If you saw the New York Times about a month and a half ago, they actually had an article on it where quantum sensors, as one means, is all of a sudden now, with the computing power, able to see if a piece of metal is moving underneath 1,000 feet of water and disturbing a little bit the water surface here. There's other technology that is in a world not to be talked about. But what I felt was, if an aircraft carrier today can strike in 24 hours, 9 times the types of targets it could do just 15, 20 years earlier, why do you need another aircraft carrier? Let's base one in Guam, where there's already one in Japan, and then you have 2 operating. So I believe that we were going to be best served with less cost by harnessing cyberspace and sensors, so that you could know, you could jam, much like we took down the nuclear reactors building capability with the virus, if you remember, of Iran for a while. So today, what we have is a danger to this. As a United States military commander, 4-star admiral has said a year ago, as he took over, who used to work for me, China now commands the Western Pacific, in testimony to the Senate. And so that's the first loss of command seized by the United States Navy since the end of World War II. As China has now established, as you saw in the papers 2 days ago, its second overseas naval base. One was in Djibouti, one is in Cambodia. And it's constructing 42 ports around the world for others, from Vanuatu to Myanmar. But that's not the real danger. The danger is that our international corporations have outsourced not just our jobs, but our national security, because the technical supply chains, where all the parts, 80% of all smartphones and 90% of all computers, all the technical parts are made in China. They have a virtual monopoly. So as you have read, if you have an Android phone, any of you, everything you say on it, programmed with software, Chinese software, is sent back there. As Bloomberg reported, servers in Amazon and Apple, as well as on Aegis cruisers in the Navy and CIA drones, have been given motherboards embedded with microchips in China that are now in their servers, or for their servers, sort of like Soviet Union sleeper agents we used to think that they had here would wake up in the world, so that they can be turned on to not only send information back, but they can also be able to prevent programs from being put on in case to try to stop that. Not to go on in this one too long, because I do believe we also need a presence not only abroad to know, but also at home. But we do protect our American dream from a rising illiberal world order, China, which is, as we come home, kicking bruised allies and telling them it's a wrap, thinking we're going to be great again, coming behind walls, when we were great when we actually formed a global concord, Republican, Democratic alike, that protected us. The 5G network is the most revolutionary internet change we will have, changing not just economies, but also warfare.
The original question was the size of the military. You described the fleet.
Yes,
The
260.
And troops. I mean, what do you think is the right size? Do we need more troops, fewer troops?
We need fewer troops and fewer ships, 260 instead of 375.
So
But the
fewer
reason for that is not just to say the word cyber warfare, but to see how cyberspace, to see how China is exploiting it, again, through the revolution of 5G networks, of which 70 countries and international organizations have already set up for them to do it, and we don't even make the part to build it.
So you have decried China owning 5G. Where do you go from here with that?
With the 5G network, it's going to be challenging because she is, with her Belt and Road Initiative, with predatory loans, as the Prime Minister of Malaysia has said, it's the new form of colonialism. And so Djibouti, to get out of 85% of its debt being owed to China, of its government debt, gave it a port. But they also all have to sign up, these countries, for the 5G network. And what that means is, because they own the one piece of equipment that only 3 companies make, and Lucent has now been sold that made it, that everything that goes through that piece of equipment they will see. So for example, this would be seen by them without hacking. A virtual business meeting will be seen with them, so they can take that commercial information. And then they have a clear way, without hacking, to go in during tensions and actually affect critical infrastructure. 120,000 waterways in America, that are controlled by dams and others, and things, for example, could be harmed. What do you do, to your question, is you don't do it like the president is doing it, just, kind of scattershot, like we're going to do this to Huawei, then we're going to trade it off here. You convene our allies and friends, Japan, the European Union specifically. You reveal to them the damage that can be done, not the word of Huawei, the company that is most threatening, that say, we're not going to let the government see this stuff. There's a law in China passed last year that said all companies will give us what we tell it to. And what we are probably, unfortunately, may end up with is 2 internets that is not conducive to world trade. I don't want to go there. So the way to do this otherwise is go to the World Trade Organization, which is broken, and regroup it. We founded it when it was GATT and it became the World Trade Organization. And what we now need to do in that is fix it to where we actually state clearly that when you bring a claim, it doesn't take you a year, it takes 60 days. And that the evidence of saying that China is doing something with its state-owned company, you lower the bar for the evidence because it's so opaque, China is, to know what's going on. And then what you do is say, define what a state-owned government, a state-owned company is of China, and what subsidies are, which is challenging because companies, even America, give subsidies to its companies. But we're going to have to understand, we're going to have to, with the allies of convening the world, not just warfare, but in trade, which this issue is about. And then you begin to move into these other countries, like Africa, which we have abysmally been involved with them. There are more military attaches in the embassies of Africa than there are diplomats across that continent. My wife works there. I visited there. When I put together, they would love us there if we would do it. I put together First Global, the first international robotic Olympics. 1 team from every nation. Women in Africa led 60% of the teams and brought them together. Had to raise the money for them to travel, but the point is we have to be involved and engaged in the world. And then that's our commercial market. That's where we're able to build our allies and friends and all, and we're not doing it. We treat, everybody said, the president says we're a piggy bank. Nonsense. That Italian Minister of Defense said it well for why they were all there in that war in Afghanistan.
Let's stick with trade, since that so affects Iowa and Iowa agriculture in particular. You criticized President Trump's kind of go-it-alone approach. Where we're sitting now with U.S., Canada-Mexico agreement not yet signed, in a trade war with China, where do you go from here?
You go exactly where I said, if I could, is stop the scattershot type of tariff here, and I'll kind of trade it off if I have a meeting here. What you do is, as I said, go back to where the European Union, Japan, the leading powers, that established the World Trade Organization, restructure it, and then together you begin to go against the injustice of China. The World Trade Organization was formed so countries wouldn't dump cheap products. It wasn't prepared for the mercantile approach of China, of massive state-owned firms, of massive subsidies, and therefore we should fix that because we can't do this by ourselves. We will need everyone to bring it together. Second, to trade specifically, 2 points. NAFTA, the thing that was wrong with NAFTA was it did not have, which is in the book I wrote in 2015 and on my website, is it did not have what I call training for a lifetime. And you especially need it today because you cannot stop a world that's changing so rapidly by just throwing up tariffs. But what we do is we spend less than any developed nation on labor force training. I'm talking the men that I had, because it was all men on the ship my first time, the people who are the plumbers, the people who are the electricians, those that build America with their hands and their mind. So they were thrown out of the job. But we didn't have, because we spend less than any developed nation, a program where skills are acquired and reacquired. In the military, when you lose a job, like potentially the coal mine closes down, we don't throw you out. We send you to the largest community college in the nation, the Air Force Community College. And if the F-15 goes away, we send you the F-22 and you're reacquired. We do that for colleges. I mean, we give loans to go to community, then to first year, and then to graduate school, and then to PhD, to acquire and reacquire. But we don't do that for both Trump supporters and Clinton supporters, the real workforce. That was wrong with NAFTA. So I'm a proponent of joining up to the Trans-Pacific Partnership that we have backed away from because it's a geopolitical, strategic issue of where China is not in it. And those nations are scared of China because if it gives them these predatory loans, Myanmar, Vanuatu, all of them, then they give them their sovereignty to get out of it. Sri Lanka gave it a port also to get out of it for 99 years. It's an illiberal value of might makes right. We have to fix it a little bit. Let's give one example, the intellectual property, where pharmaceuticals rolled in and said, when you negotiate this, White House, make sure the patent gets extended out there. So we don't want those generic guys coming in to compete about us. But we have to. But it's alongside this training for a lifetime program that, you know, the $2 billion, it's needed by private, public side because, look, 1/3 of all small businesses, and we're only creating half the number of small businesses as we did per 110,000 Americans today as we did back 30 years ago. But those ones that are being created said 1/3 of them have said we can't get the skilled workforce. So today people say, well, it's low unemployment. No, wait a moment. Remember, the labor participation rate is only 63%. I mean, during those great years of the Clinton administration, as our economy was booming, it was 67%. That's about 10 million Americans who are not counted in the unemployment rate. And one of them, basically, I met. Lost his job on a bus because I went to a homeless shelter after I was elected before I was sworn in, a food pantry. Because you know how the Postal Service collects canned foods all the time. I want to see who comes in here. One of them was a guy who lost his job. I said, what was it? Bus driver. He said, well, are you going to do something else? I said, I don't have the money to learn a new skill. So that's why so many of them have moved over here. That's why the real program, I mean, I have a way to fix the college debt, I think, and to help it, because our government is making $127 billion of profit this decade because it has it based on the wrong interest rate, 10-year Treasury. But we've got to focus on that blue-collar, white-collar worker there that has been thrown out, trying to change and move it over. So that's why you have to do both of those, sign up for these trade deals, make them as fair as possible, but understand you've got to take care of the engine of our economy, the worker, as you do it with this training for a lifetime. And therefore, I would have supported NAFTA if that had been there.
Can you dwell a little bit more on this training for
Sure.
a lifetime idea? And Andrew Yang was in these same offices last week, I believe it was. He was saying these job training programs that we now have aren't working. that people aren't getting new jobs in the thing they've been trained on, or people aren't signing up. So how would this be structured, and how, you know, in Pennsylvania, obviously this NAFTA has been an issue. Like, how would you make sure that Pennsylvanians get that training, and who would pay for it?
It's a great question, and I don't know the specifics of what his example is, but I was saying the same thing a couple years ago, because even though we spend so little compared to other developed nations, there was I'm going to be a little off in this number, but it's in the book, is I think it was like 15 or 20 billion, all right? By government alone. A study was done by the GAO that said they are duplicative, wasteful, and there's no measures of effectiveness for any of them but 2. And they're spread across like 9 agencies and 17 down here. Now, a piece of legislation came out to try to force this, but my way of doing it takes an example like there's a engineering firm, I've forgotten the name of it, but again, it's in the book, and I went to visit the same type of approach in Philadelphia, where it's public-private. And what they do is, it's facilitated by a grant from the government. Companies know what they need. So this engineering firm said to Wendy's, tell you what, you have workers there for minimum wage or whatever they pay. If they'll come to mine on weekends, on their own time, for 6 to 12 months, until I assess it, I will train them for an engineering job. Wendy's loved it because it meant that they were likely to stay and not have rapid turnover, all right? Workers loved it because they're trained to skill. Engineering loved it because they got somebody who was committed. It's why the military tries to take only those who finish high school. Doesn't mean the others aren't good, but it shows a commitment. And so therefore, they get a trained workforce. I went to visit a similar firm I write about here in Philadelphia. So my proposal is it's a private-public approach built on infrastructure that's already there, which is community colleges and labor and all. But it's facilitated by the government. But here's what's the real problem, why it hasn't happened. Government is the executive, I'm talking about the executive branch. Unfortunately, I understand why people have lost faith at times in government. It doesn't execute well. It may pass programs. So, as an example, we beat Germany and Japan in 4 years, the United States government did. But we couldn't roll out a healthcare website in 4 years. And so you sit here and say, it has to be with a president who actually makes the executive branch execute. And I think that's a large part of the reasons people have lost faith. But this is why you want public-private to do this, because private knows what they need. There's also other problems, like you have to have the money to move someplace, and things like that. And there's more to it. But that's why I describe it this way.
Let's talk about health care.
Yes.
You have supported a public option, but then want to transition to something perhaps modeled after the VA you've talked about. Why is that better than the kind of Medicare for all?
It isn't. And this is, again, one that I keep thinking about and understanding. The reason, first off, was for public option is I voted for it when I was in Congress until the Senate took it out because it couldn't withstand the pressure from the pharmaceutical health insurance industry. So, and the concept was that it was, when the public option came up and I talked to people whose idea it was, is people would get into it as a choice. And then it proves itself in a transition towards single payer. Now you can do single payer one of 2 ways, and single payer, as we all know, means the government is paying. I was very taken with the VA because most people beat up on the VA. But as a World War II vet said at an event yesterday, I can't leave the VA. It's wonderful. And in fact, the New England Journal of Medicine has said, and the RAND Corporation subsequent to it said, and there's another new study out a few months ago, that on 11 indications of medical care, the VA ranks equal or better than private health care provision. If you've ever been there, my wife has worked again on suicide prevention for the VA, is that it has the best integrated mental health there is. But once you get into it, except for some spots, it's pretty darn good. So I think it can work, single payer. It's just not, oh, it's a name to me, all right? And I bring that up because the VBA is the real problem, the benefit side. It takes you a year or more to get in. We got to fix that, and there's ways to fix it. But Medicare for all, those who advocate it, and it's difficult to know what they actually mean, but clarifying it as we kept looking at it, is it means where you have private doctors, private hospitals, but the government pays for it. I'm not opposed to that. What I am opposed to is saying it's going to happen in 2 or 4 years. When my daughter's brain cancer came back, and the same medical heroes who saved her once saved her again, if anybody had said, wait a minute, we're changing you next year, no. 255 million Americans are in some form of private health care. I'm military, I am, former military. Medicare Advantage is private health care. Medicaid managed is. So when you count those numbers up, it's 255. And just all of a sudden say in 2 or 4 years it's going to happen, how you treat people when you try to care for them matters. And so that's why I like this transition of choice, I call it. But as it begins to show it, then you have 2 paths to go. Personally, I'd love to see 2 types of public options, and every state could pick that. And as the right one appears of which way is better, you can go to it. I'm growing to be taken with the private health hospitals. Why? Well, wait a minute. University of Pennsylvania and Johns Hopkins do pretty mighty fine things. Mayo Clinic has had some problems, as good as they are. You know that, with their CEO and other things. So, you know, but I know the VA can work, but do we really have to go that way if this is there?
Things, though. Let's talk so you support a public option to give people.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you support.
And single payer.
And then what health insurance do you have? TRICARE.
I have TRICARE, which is run by Humana.
And what did your daughter have when she had?
4 years old, she had glioblastoma, which is the same as John McCain.
Insurance?
I don't have insurance. It is run by TRICARE. I have insurance. It's TRICARE. I pay my premium, all that.
So your daughter was covered by that?
Yes, if you stay in X amount of years, you're covered by it. And Humana, the private company, has. So, for example, Humana denied us the drug for her care for her brain cancer. So we go through the same challenges others do with private industry. There's $300,000. We were going to borrow it or do something. We appealed it, and we were very fortunate because it was a new drug that had only been used for metastasized breast cancer. And the doctor said, we can't do the same as we did last time because she barely survived the chemo. So we want to use this new drug. We think that can help her. Only 8% of kids live.
And that was the $300,000?
It's a $300,000 drug, and it's it's one of the new ones. And so that's what Children's told us it was going to be, because we also can go to another hospital than military one, but we appealed it and won. So I understand the challenges, and I understand why they did it.
So they then paid for that drug for your daughter, the insurance?
They did.
And that's what worked for her?
It's in remission, and as you know, yes, she's in a safe harbor. Mm-hmm. So healthcare is the reason I ran initially, to your wonderful question, is when I ran in a nearly 2-to-1 Republican district, I didn't even talk initially about the war of Iraq. I'm a retired Navy admiral, run international security that begins at home and health security.
So separately, the VA system, one thing we've written quite a bit is, you have a parallel healthcare system. You have the system we all use, and then you have the VA, which is available to, 5 million people or so.
9 million.
And so, should that be opened up? Should we eliminate this separate system of bricks and mortar buildings?
Nice question. That's why I'm saying maybe that becomes the model and it gets expanded, or that's why I said let's have the people moving into this public option. But as I said to my staff this morning, after about 4 or 5 years, we see that one of those 2 ways is working best, then you make it a bit more compulsory. You might say people from 50 and above will move into this single payer over X amount of years. And they could either move into the VA, to grow it, or you just model it and you expand it on it. Those details, obviously, I should have everyone, but I don't. But that's why I think the VA, based upon the markers and the measures of effectiveness, can work. If you read the wonderful book written by a woman called Wounds of War that just came out about a year ago, it walks everybody through this. She doesn't get into it should be the model for.
It's a good system. You're right.
It is.
So maybe we open it up to more people.
That could be it. But I just don't want people to be pushed into it. I want them to see that it works. And right now, the impression of most people's minds, because of there were problems in the VA, but they were isolated. But most people think the VA, weren't there problems there? there is a problem. This president has tried to privatize it. And there has been cost overruns of $2 billion in his effort, and they actually have redone it after they were overcharged $90 million by the private company. And now they've redone it in a new formula that the VA groups have said, well, please, wait a minute, this isn't right. So it can work. How you transition to it is the issue. And ma'am, I don't disagree with you. I think you could expand it. It's just that in the military, excuse the expression, piss poor planning gives piss poor execution. And that's what I want to make sure that the government, to your question, executes this well. And I don't think we executed the Affordable Care Act as well as we could have. I'm for it, but you know, we took too much heat for not being able to explain it and all that.
Let's move on to climate change.
Yes.
You've supported a fee on carbon emissions, and then you say you'd return a dividend
Yes.
to consumers. Would that all come back to consumers, or just part of it?
Yes, and actually it has it later on in a small place is this fee that would increase every year, all right, would then be returned to all citizens, but a portion of it would go into research and development, particularly for one item. I mean, you can do more green manufacturing. There is no way we will make the zero emissions we need to by 2050 unless we suck CO2 that's up there out of the atmosphere. There are several technologies, one particular called DAC, I believe, that has been demonstrated that you can do it and then either store it as a liquid or burn it again and just pull it out so at least stays zero. If you didn't have to do is just pull it out to get a deficit. The problem is it's not cost effective. It would cost trillions to do what you have to do, trillions and trillions. So the research would be into, like anything, much like when solar panels began, is to make it cost effective. That's the primary reason I want it there, because the analysis shows we're not going to make it up here. And the primary reason isn't just us. I mean, it's a challenge for us to even try to make it. 194 of the 196 nations in the Paris Accord have not met their commitment, again, convening the world. And here's the challenges, for one example, and two, if you don't mind, is that, take Saudi Arabia. It will use as much electricity to power its air conditioning in a decade as it exports in oil today. We have not signed up to the Gali Agreement, which has to do with hydrofluorocarbons. Nor does EPA have any authority right now to control them. And yet, all developed nations don't have to even meet the hydrofluorocarbon for another decade. But yet they're 1,000 times worse than CO2 if they're released. Not only that, 8% of the tropics has air conditioning, the rest don't. Africa, which is why I stress this, what we should be doing engaging the world, will have, at the end of the century, 1 out of every 4 persons living will be in Africa. Almost 45% of the population by the end of 2040 will be in the middle or higher income. The first thing you get when you move into that is a smartphone. The second thing is air conditioning. If we get them and mandate through the Kigali Agreement or others that all nations will have the most efficient air conditioning standard, which is 1/3 better than the, which means it uses 1/3 the electricity of the average one that people install, it will be equivalent to reforesting 2/3 of the Amazon. And that's why I say when I go around to people that, look, don't look at me just a foreign policy guy. I went to Congress for health care. I moved the first money into autism in 12 years. I passed the first Elder Abuse Act in 17. But I do recognize that these challenges to us, contracting our American dream by China, climate change, the most catastrophic threat to mankind, can't be done by us alone because we can only do 15% of stopping the damage. And so that's why we have to convene our leadership again in the world in order to bring that downgrade in global emissions elsewhere. Is it a challenge? It's double. Think how hard it is to do here. You can't even get Republican Democrats to talk on it. But how are we going to get China that's going to build 1,600 coal plants in the next decade, because it's moving its old coal plants out of its country and putting them into the developed countries? It doesn't want the pollution, so it's going to put it there.
One other part of your climate change plan, you talk about the role that agriculture
Yes.
plays in emissions. And you've talked about trying to incentivize changes away from kind of industrial agriculture. That would probably describe much of the agriculture in Iowa right now. Why that change, and how would you encourage it?
This is a corporate monopoly issue. And we have two areas in our sector where the antitrust laws have not been applied. Worse, they're probably not structured for it. One is cyber, the Apples, the Facebooks of the world, the Comcast and NBC mergers of the world. It was really structured for antitrust. The other is agriculture. As you know, one company, Monsanto, provides all the seed here for corn acreage. 80%, I apologize, all right? They've got a monopoly because there's 4 companies in the world that provide 60% of all seeds in the world. But here's what's challenging. It's not just the mergers, it's a vertical one. So if you buy farm equipment, you're forbidden to repair it yourself. You've got to give it up. If you buy the seed from the genetically modified, you're forbidden to reseed using it. You've got to buy it from them every year. And by the way, 25% of their profit comes from selling the fertilizer that they've made the seed and the corn resistant to. But the damage is what you've mentioned. This has caused, this massive problem of, where the small farmer has gone away and the profits have gone up, but, the people are, it's much more expensive. So what you have to do to get to your question is you've got to change this. We have no choice because industrialized ways of doing it. So I propose that you should have what I call as one way to begin it, as you're breaking this down apart, because it's a monopoly. And the way they do it is, as you well know, now they have to, because Roundup, you have super weeds happening because they've learned, like any species has learned how to get around Roundup. Now they're adding 2 more chemicals to it, and cancer and all assumed. So this is a problem. But by breaking them up, you begin to get also where you incentivize them and you establish what I call a national farm bank. In a 24th century, you might call it Sustainable Homestead Act, to where you take this unused farmland that they're gobbling up, and you actually, for $2 billion, this is a very preliminary analysis, all right, back of the envelope. For $2 billion in this, where we gobble up, you could actually employ about 20,000 people to begin, particularly those who are in a marginalized community, to begin over 7 years, if the USDAO will do its proper job and give them the proper amount of loans that can be paid back. But the commitment is that they will do organic, regenerative type of farming. And so you don't till every year. I'm somewhat familiar with this because I was vice chairman of the Small Business Committee, which is another issue because I was able to be vice chairman as a freshman. I thought they wanted to show they had a sense of humor, but that wasn't it. Nobody goes to small business because there's opaque money there. The Chamber of Commerce claims they do, but it doesn't. But I founded the Dairy Caucus, co-founded it, because we were losing so many dairy farms, if you remember, in the middle of last decade. And so you want to begin this no-tillage. You want to have these hedge grows, that's what we call in Pennsylvania, to where you have that boundary with normal, the insects that do have so much, and tillage destroys all that, sequestration and everything. And then you might put in what they call prairie slots in there. And then but that's the commitment you do. So that's one way of doing it, but I'm hoping that if we begin to stop this vertical type of monopolization. I can't tell you it's going to be an immediate transition that way. This is a positive way of doing it. This is you might call it a negative way of trying to break that up so that we no longer take hogs. 115 was the average number of hogs in 1978 per farmer. Now it's 2,000, or 5,000, excuse me. And we've gone from farmers from 7 million down to 2 million across here. The other is foreign ownership. Countries like China, Russia, and Saudi Arabia and others now own much farmland in America as the state of Illinois. You have in Iowa since the early 70s a law that prevents aliens to do it, but that doesn't mean they can't establish a corporation, U.S. corporations, and buy it. And so, you know, I think Franklin Delano Roosevelt said, you know, we destroy our soil, we destroy America. And we are destroying our soil right now.
Do you support the nationwide $15 minimum wage? You supported a lower figure. at
Yes,
your
I
last
did.
Senate
And
run.
again, the analysis shows that, that if you do not raise the minimum wage above half, 50% of the average hourly wage, those who say raise the minimum wage and you lose jobs are wrong. If you raise it above that, you do. So, right now, for next year, I was looking at this the other day, is the average hourly wage, 50% of that would mean like a $13.80 one. So again, when people will say, well, it's got to be this amount, what do you base that on? Why that amount? Is it arbitrary or is there something? So what we did, again, as I was teaching, and then later on to prove it is, I looked at it, and there's analysis. There's tons of studies that have been on what are called coterminous counties. One of them is actually in New Jersey that borders one near where I lived. And that New Jersey raised the average hourly wage, I think it was 46% of the average hourly wage, and over here it wasn't raised in Pennsylvania. So a couple years later it was studied and found out that jobs weren't lost. There are others where they've raised it above the average hourly wage and jobs are lost. Canada also did an analysis on this also. So what I said was, yes, we can. Now, we understand, you know, I voted for increased hourly wage went down when I went into Congress. It was my second vote. But today, the average hourly wage is, if I have it right, 1/3 less than in real money than it was in the 60s. So we got to do it, but do it in a way that, you know, it should go right now today to basically $13.80. And then as we begin to get small businesses going back, you know, instead of 18 being created for every 10,000 citizens each year, because there's a problem why they aren't growing, you get back to 36, which used to be for a long period of time, more jobs, wages increase because demand goes up and that hourly wage keeps on going up, and so does the minimum wage.
So you want the wage to be 13, what do you think the minimum wage?
Right now, it should be about $13.80 today. I can get you that exact figure, but it's roughly about that because I just happened to
That's
look
what
to
you
see.
that's what you would seek to.
Immediately today, but it would continue as the average hourly wage goes up. But you need, therefore, to make the demand on wages goes up, that should go up, and that gets to the next step of the plan, which is most Americans, majority of them work in a small business. But as I mentioned, today we're only creating 18 small businesses that spring up for every 10,000 working Americans. Back in, let's say, Ronald Reagan's time, for example, it was 36. Our star running back that creates 70% of all new jobs is only on the football field for half the game, 18 minutes instead of 36 minutes. And so what you want to do is, what's the problem? How do you get them back up again to increase the wages, because the demand will then go on the limited wage force, which gets us into the immigration issue, by the way. It's all connected. And then what you have is that, if you've looked at it, particularly since 2000, it costs a small business 40% more to handle regulation than it does a big company that can marginalize it. Number two, it can't get the mother's milk of a small business startup, which is investment to start. There's several reasons for that. Venture capital, which isn't the biggest for small business, but nevertheless, 80% of venture capital today is in 3 large metropolitan areas. Second, angel investors, those that give the 10,000 up to $500,000. We should be doing to them what Wisconsin up the road did. What they said is, we're going to write off 50% of your investment in a startup small business. They quadrupled in a year, and I haven't looked at it since. They quadrupled in a year the number of angels investors and startups. I've forgotten how many, from that just much more sprang up. And so that's one of my proposals. But the regulation is tough. But here's the problem with that. We have an office, and I was vice chairman of the Small Business Committee, which nobody goes to, but it was wonderful because that's where 80% of all people work, and much of my legislation got passed via that, was because nobody was watching. Was there's an office there called the Small Business Advocacy Office, where they have lawyers and economists that crawl through regulations, and billions have been saved, says that doesn't apply for small business. We should be expanding that. Number two, though, get it while it's young. That's why pre-K education is so good, important. Get people when they're young. So what you have a law passed in 1999 that says when a regulation is beginning, you are to have the private businesses and others sitting at the table to be part of it. The United States government, I think, has used it one time. What they do is they develop a thing, it then gets put on the public register. A small business is trying to survive, but the big business, Apple, has his lawyer go over there, peer through it, and say, please change this. By the way, I gave you PAC money recently. He doesn't say that, but you know. And the small business guy doesn't. But they should be at the table trying to shape that so this group doesn't have to be over here. And that's why a part of this economy could really be booming if you started to focus upon who creates 70% of all jobs, but get them on the football field for the entire period of time.
You mentioned immigration.
Yes.
We'd be remiss if we didn't discuss it. You support a pathway to citizenship, also stepped up border security, you emphasize technology. How does your plans, how do they differ from those of the rest of the field?
I'm not sure how much they differ, quite frankly. I mean, I know they're generally probably in support of that, but I don't know all the details of the others. It's only been 4 weeks that I'm trying. But, and I think they'll probably find plans they have, but I don't know. First off, I do want to talk about this issue on the border. We have within our government a refugee setup to take care of refugees. It's called the Mass Strategy Program, where FEMA, along with the Red Cross, public-private, responds in America when we have refugees from hurricanes and our citizens. They should be down there tomorrow handling these families or children. They're trained to do that, not ICE. And then they immediately get the children back with their parents or whomever, and they're not in detention. And then you have foreign aid. Remember, military stop problems, we don't fix them. Our forefathers stopped Germany. We fixed fascism with the Marshall Plan because it took 2 years and fascism was still alive in that country. And we did. That's what we have to do down to the northern triangle of countries, as well as a bit of Nicaragua, which is starting to have more problems. And then you get down there and you help the source of that problem. I've forgotten which country. We had a pretty good program running down there, those three. I think it was Honduras, and we walked away from it. And so that should help on the migration issue. But I do believe, I understand protecting our borders. I got that. There's other things when I handled the Navy's anti-terrorism unit that were back there then. I don't know if they're back there now, where Al-Qaeda used to use the drug cartel for funding and all that. Okay, I got that. But there's not a wall you can't climb over. There's other ways smartly to do it. Also for humanitarian concerns, those deserts. We have a global hawk by 24 hours can look down, see if somebody's trekking there, and instead of having citizens have to leave water for them, they can, signal down with write the picture over here and a Jeep can drive over. But what's most important, I believe, is the recognition that American women have not had a birth rate, because I want to protect our economy, that has been sufficient since 1970 to replace those we unfortunately lose every year. If it had not been for immigration of all types, as I told Breithart the other day, we would be in a population death spiral, not unlike Japan, which doesn't have immigration, and as a result, their economy has stagnated, one of the primary reasons the last couple decades, and now they don't know what to do as their population is even growing older and older, and we are going to have it worse because baby boomers are now retiring to add to it big time. So we've got to get those we need, the immigrants, as my father was. We've got to get them out of the shadows, and we've got to get them to the back of the line. Go through as the bipartisan bills that I spoke up on back when I was in Congress. John McCain, Ted Kennedy, bipartisan, George Bush. They all wanted to have a bipartisan bill and solve this issue for all Americans. somebody who could say, this is why it has to be, it's our economy. And then I think we can move forward. Do we need to open it up? Yeah. One of the things in agriculture is we do need to lift the number for these migrant workers, but we also have to take care of their conditions in poultry and other things. We also have to open it up for those, and an expedited process of those who are up here and have STEM education, they're staying here. Why do we lose them? And so this is an issue that unfortunately is preventing us from moving on to others. But these were my positions, my nearly 2-to-1 Republican district. As I said, 100% voting record by NAREL to an FNNRA, but yet we talked about them in open all the time. Disagreed with me on choice, had a care. Saturday morning, 8 o'clock, come on in. And the first time, 60 people showed up. The second quarter, 40. And after that, it attrited. They didn't agree with me, but I think we disagreed well. To even where the Tea Party Patriots asked for a picture with me after all those healthcare, Paul. Didn't mean they voted for me, but we disagreed well. And I think that's where we have to go again in United America. But this issue, we need them.
In your 2 races for Senate, you were outraised, outspent. This time around, you acknowledge you've gotten a late start. How do you overcome those?
Yeah. Well, we have to put in perspective also. Please recognize that I did learn when I ran against Senator Arlen Specter, which I think I told you, it's better to offend God than a politician because at least God gives forgiveness. So when I ran again, despite my voting record, it's pretty progressive, and practical progressive. I say everybody in the military has health care, why doesn't society, is they spent more on me, the DSCC, Democratic Senatorial Committee, in television ads than they spent trying to beat Mitch McConnell. So, there's documented at least 6 million, and we know there was more, that for a pharmaceutical lobbyist I was running against for a period of time, and that was the point. The Republicans then pivoted, and that was my point about accountability, and said, whoa, this is the year of draining the swamp, and you're supporting a pharmaceutical lobbyist. So to me, it's actually a badge of honor that I ran for the right reason at a cost against Arlen Specter, where in the Me Too generation today, he would never have been accepted by the Democratic Party. But where were they then when the deed was done? Like Iraq. And your question was wonderful. What did you say in the military? I didn't throw it out, but when I was asked, I told them. And so, as I did on LGBT at the time by a 2-star ad blast. But the point is that, to me, as what happened in a Pizza Taverno the other day, is a woman came up who was a waitress afterwards and said, I voted for Trump last time, I don't want to vote for him this time. And I'm ashamed to say it, but I'm a Democrat. Said, but I was looking for someone to vote for, and I think you might be it. To have a 3-star admiral standing alongside Mr. Trump, who also said to his party, when you're wrong, I'm for you people. I think is what this nation actually needs to begin to unite. In the primary, yeah, it's going to be tough. I got that. I'm no later than Bill Clinton was a few years ago, but I understand that the dynamics have changed. But everybody had a challenge. You could be a mayor from a small town, but he's overcome the challenge. Mine is, I'm in a little late, but Iowa is different. It's not grassroots, it's grass seed. So I've been to 20 counties, not just once is our plan, but like last night, I went back to 120 people. I'd been to the Disability Caucus 3 times here. I went to the 3rd time there, and I said, how many people have seen me talk? Half raised their hand. How many have heard of me? They all had. And so I'm doing it systematically because in the military amateurs do tactics, experts do logistics. And this place is set up to have a beachhead. I'm living out in Econo Lodge, great deal. But we also have recruited them to where I'm going to go to a Hindu temple. Because I used to go to another place of worship. When my party opposed me, for example, and I was shut down in Philadelphia by the party boss, couldn't go to any wars, the president's against you. So I went to over 200 African American churches. They were my best demographic. So my first stop here, when I flew in, it wasn't political, was to go to Antioch First Baptist Church, the African American in Waterloo, where the pastor was a vet, to make a point that, to myself, that this was my best. So we're working it that way. We've 10th in the polls right now, tied for 10th, I mean, we can't snuff of that. If they say 2% is good enough, that should be good enough. And I've shaken over 25,000 hands. by running in parades. They pass that brochure up, of which I gave you 3. You can pass it around if you like. And it's, and I run back and forth and I shake every hand. So I start at the beginning of the parade consciously, and by the time I'm back here and I say, that's me, retired Navy Admiral, I'm in late, please take me home tonight and read about me. And right now as I speak, we've got people passing out 4,000 brochures. That wonderful July 4th Symphony that you have here, and the 28th you have one at Waterworks, I think. There are going to be guys passing out the brochure. And so we'll work our way, get the name recognition. We're already starting air. My second press secretary showed up today, worked for me before. A gentleman left his job in Paris to come back who worked for me as my comms director. Now we're going to the air campaign, making sure that we start working that with ads and stuff like that as the money comes in.
A final 30 seconds or so, what are your last thoughts?
My last thought is probably just a story. And I would ask everybody just to come aboard an aircraft carrier with me, just for a moment, with the youth of America. If anybody doesn't think their youth of America aren't great, come aboard. There's 5,000 of them. You know what their average age is? 19 and a half. They run a nuclear reactor. They fix your plane before you get into it. And the pilot never kicks the tire and says, is it going to work? No, they just give them a little salute, turn on their engine, they strap you to a sling called a catapult, they push the button, and off you go at 0200 o'clock in the morning. And if those engines are working, there's no ride in America, including Walt Disney, that beats that ride. But sometimes the air boss calls down, stop, shut down the engines, get out. They need an EA-6B, not an F-18 over Afghanistan. And then you see what I believe makes America great and why our country most yearns for it again. A young youth, could be from Waterloo or Des Moines, walks out on that carrier deck in the night, goes underneath the belly of the plane where he or she can't see, and unhooks it from the belly, from that belly of the plane, to the strap from the catapult. Because no pilot will shut off that engine until they know they've been unhooked, because they are 19 and a half years old. If they push that button by mistake because they misheard it, and you go off without your engines, it's a great, but it's a final ride. And so that young man and woman, because they can't be seen unhooking it, walks in front of that plane and looks up at it and gives a very simple signal like this, and then doesn't move until he or she, the pilot, shuts off their engines, opens up the canopy, and gets safely on deck. That man, that woman, that youth has said everything that our country most yearns for. Go ahead, you can trust me, because I'm willing to be accountable to you. And if I made a mistake and suddenly you start heading overboard to your death with your engines turned off, you're going right through me. And I'm going overboard with you to my own. I meet very few people who have ever said to me, I believe somebody in Washington, D.C. would stand in front of that plane for them. I want to as president. Because our Hobson's choice is not to elect a president only. It is to heal this nation's soul. Because we cannot meet the defining challenges of our time, abroad or at home, for whom we are, in our soul, our character, without a united America. And that is really why I'm running. Thank you.
Thank you, Admiral.